time and Jen's time for being here. So Jen's going to get us started, and then first off, the three of you know me very well. So I think Hannah's frozen, or at least for me.
Yeah, me
too. But open conversation. Please interrupt with questions, discussion, whatever jumps to mind, please do so. Okay. Jen, I'll let you take it from here. We have somebody else joining as well.
Okay, great.
Ivy.
Hello.
Ivy.
So I'm Jen Cort, and I am a consultant. I was a assistant head of a lower school and the head of a middle school, senior administrator, all the things. In independent schools, you have so many titles. And a few years ago, my first PK class graduated, so I felt I should graduate too, and was offered a head of school position, but really found my heart and my mission leaning more toward equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice. And I'm a clinical social worker, so I bring a lot of the elements of conversation into that and building capacity for challenging conversations on almost any topic. So that's what I do. And a little plug, because it's totally free and everything. I have a podcast called Third Space. Blake's on it. She's coming up in a future episode. And it is all equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice by leading practitioners who come in and share their ideas, and students and faculty and parents. So love for you all to join that too and listen for Blake's episode. So did I lose volume?
No, you're good.
Okay.
No, you're totally good. First off, before you continue, tell us the name of your podcast. So if I don't get the link out fast enough, they can search for it.
It's Third Space. It's actually, Hannah, I decided to name it that after, because I used to work for a Latin school in Chicago, and I was at the NNSP conference and attended the session about your third space that you all use for your public purpose, and that term was being referred to, and I'd heard it many times, and I was like, that's what my podcast needs to be. So
oh, nice. I work at the lab school, but I know what you're referring to at Latin.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, you're fine. I like that name. That's a good idea.
Thanks.
So Jen, do you need some direction from me, or do you want to just
That'd be great, because I'm not sure what the framing was beforehand. So
the framing is just, we all are here to talk about how to provide adequate professional development for teachers and or advisors to be able to navigate community engagement programs and civic engagement and partnerships that might bring up conversations that they feel ill-equipped to facilitate.
Yeah. Well, and that's so commonly the case, right? And nowadays, I feel like we're being hit with conversations that we have no preparation for.
Right.
So the way I think about this is there's conversations and skills that go with specifically, and I think with public-private purpose, the connection, you often socioeconomics come up. And you can spend a lot of time learning about the specifics of those conversations. But I think before that, it's really helpful for teachers and advisors to have capacity building around having a challenging conversation, or a conversation that challenges them, firstly. And so there's a lot of pieces that I think go into it that can make it much easier. The first is for schools to be really clear about what their values are. And to make sure that the values are really tangible. So what it looks like when it's challenged is when there's a value statement, there's a mission statement, and then maybe there's a diversity statement separately, and people can opt into whichever statement works best for them instead of pulling them together and making one. So always going back to the values. But then I think, and I have, like, I'll send this to you because I have I need a better hobby. I write lesson plans for fun on dealing with a lot of these topics. And I wrote one on developing community norms for PK to 12 conversations. The biggest advice that I have is for schools to concretely and consistently name and create their community norms and the norms of the spaces. So when I say spaces, I mean every space on campus, because certainly they're learning in the hallway as much about how they treat each other and navigate conversations as much as they do in the classroom. And so having the norms is really important, because one of the norms can and should be, how are we going to handle it when a conversation is too much for me to be able to learn? Like, how do I know that, and what can I do to help myself? So that's for when you're with the kids, but also to introduce one of the things that I think is primary is for we adults to have a script that we'll use when we are challenged by a topic. So, and it's a script that is not about race or socioeconomics or about, gender. It's about how I deal with that conversation. So mine, for example, is really looking at the person, really seeing them and saying, that's such an important moment, important conversation. I need time to process that, or time to really give it the weight that it deserves. And I will come back to you, and then make sure you come back to the person. But that gives me breathing room. That gives me time to pause and go get help if I need it. That gives me time to go to a colleague and go, oh my gosh, I don't know how I'm going to do this. And that also just gives me some space to gather myself together. So those are two of the things I think are like the first foundational best way to go. The thing that's a guiding thought in all of this is that they're called challenging conversations, because if we wait for them to become comfortable, that ship is never going to come in. It's never going to dock. So what we need to do is acknowledge the discomfort and be willing to grow through it anyway, because it's for a higher value than letting a conversation not happen because of our discomfort.
And so how do you suggest schools provide this education or empowerment to their teachers? How is that best given to them?
So I think it starts with, it's what I believe firmly. It starts with everyone in the faculty and staff thinking about the topics that they are nervous about or uncomfortable about, including the ones that they worry will happen, and making a note of those. And then so this is for the individual. So maybe in a faculty meeting, like, let's all think about it. That becomes almost like your dashboard. So if you know that you're nervous about that, or you didn't handle a conversation the way you wish you could have in the past, or you're worried it's going to come up, that is your topic that you need to learn more about. And it's different for everyone. So that's one of the first ones, and it's an easy, quick activity to do. You could just have people take 10 minutes. Think about sometime you were really uncomfortable, or you're worried you will be uncomfortable. What was the topic? Write it down. That becomes your homework or your way of going forward. The other is for the school. I'm thinking, like, if I were in faculty meeting, I would go back to what are the stated values and what do they actually look like and sound like in our school? And what do they look like and sound like when they're challenged? And naming for the faculty and staff, like, I'm thinking if this was a faculty meeting, I'd start off with that topic, the topics that make us uncomfortable. I'd go back into the values and name for the group that values are not poured into children. They need to be tested. They need to be challenged. That's how they own their own values and how they nuance them for themselves. So then having the conversation as a faculty about, what do you do and what can we do as a group when the values are tested? How do we support each other? And then how do we hold to the values? And then I would have the conversation about what are the norms, because if you're not intentionally creating norms in your spaces with kids, the norms are being created without you. And they look all kinds of ways. And they include, I work with thousands of kids a year, and I can't tell you, every time I'm with kids without the adults in the room, I'll say, do you all know who you can talk about certain things around and who you can't? And they all know. And a lot of times it's because those norms have been created because of the absence of a conversation or the presence of a conversation. So then I'd give them some framework around what do we want the norms to look like here? How do they connect to the values? A really simple one that I think is really helpful is, if we were living out our values about challenging conversations, if I were videotaping, what would I see? And if I were audio taping or doing a voice memo, what would I hear? And then what would I like to see? And this is a great group faculty activity. And what would I like to hear? And what do we need to do to connect what we would see and hear now and what do we want to see and hear? And then along the way, when that's challenging for you, who could you go to? And I have a little simple activity that, Blake, I'm happy to send you for you to share with everyone. It's a way of kind of getting at, these are all the topics schools deal with that are often challenging for us. Go around the room and find people who feel comfortable talking about those topics. So at the end, you leave with a chart of, here's race, here's socioeconomics, here's privilege status, whatever the words are. And here are people I could go to if I'm feeling challenged by that topic. So you're normalizing that everybody has topics that are challenging for them, and that within the faculty and staff, there is capacity to support that conversation.
So Jen, the obvious question to me is, this is great for the faculty that are eager participants and really willing to work on themselves.
Yep.
And to expose themselves for things that are challenging and not. How do you, and those aren't the faculty members that I think they would probably naturally say, hold on a second, this is super important, but I need a few minutes to think about this, or I need to figure out how we can respond or discuss this. How do you get the reluctant faculty members who don't think this is part of their job to facilitate these conversations? How do you get them on board?
Okay, so first of all, I just clicked off. Are you all still able to see me? Okay, good. So how you get them on board is, I'm laughing because that's always the conversation. So education, we are called, especially those of us who are in independent schools, we are constantly being called to innovate. There's a new shiny object in education that we're supposed to be learning about. I mean, a couple of years, iPads in the classroom, differentiated instruction, whatever it is, there's always something. And so the school, it's not an option in our schools to not be innovative. Now you've got some teachers who are not doing it anyway, but the school itself is calling for that. So I think the really helpful thing to do is to help attach this process to anything like that. I was working with a group of faculty the other day on the same topic. And I said, I can't help my 13-year-old with math anymore because I don't understand the way she's being taught, and I'm frustrating her by not being able to teach it, but I still need to be a resource to her about math. And that's really what it's about. I think schools have to kind of take a stand on that we all need to be growing and learning in these conversations because we're expecting the kids to grow and learn. And if that doesn't work, if the moral and ethical teaching practices don't grab us enough, then we can look to a lot of the research that's just a couple of years old. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Harvard Making Caring Common project, but if you are, then you may know that the originations of that, the roots of that project were based in Harvard and 85 other universities being asked, what makes some kids jump off the page for you, assuming the resumes are all basically the same. And they came up with some what we used to call soft skills. Understanding, these are my words, like differences are additives, not dividers. And kindness is more of a verb than a adjective, and all these other things that are really about how we must be helping our kids to actualize these conversations and this work. At the same time, Forbes, CNBC, and at Business Week, I think several business organizations were asking themselves what skills are needed to prepare kids for the jobs that don't yet exist. And if they're going to have these jobs, what skills do we teach them and who's going to teach them? And they were doing this around the same time as a Harvard study, and they found all the same things. The kids need to be able to think, to learn from each other. They need to be able to move through discomfort to places of understanding. They need to appreciate that working together is just as valuable as working alone. They need to be curious about differences and how those differences contribute to who we are. And there's all these groups had different findings that they came up with that all supported the same thing. So when I'm working with faculty and staff who are kind of resistant, I talk about, these are, okay, so morally it didn't get you, I don't say that, but I think that, but these are college and job readiness skills. And if they're not going to learn, if the kids are not going to learn from us in the safety of the school that is nurturing them about how to engage in challenging conversations, where are they going to learn it? And if they're going to learn it from us, we need to be modeling that and practicing that. So I put it on a parallel track, kind of like when we put out a new, when we change our curriculum some, our departments usually work together to identify the pitfalls and the challenges and the strengths and the joys, and how are we going to roll this out together? How are we going to support each other in growing through and learning this? And it's that same kind of thing, that this needs to be viewed as curriculum and content. Rather than a separate additive opt-in, opt-out, because these are job and college readiness skills. They're also human readiness skills, but I know that the job and college stuff tends to get to people to help them want to engage because that is their job.
So can you give us an example of where you've seen this done really well?
Yeah. So let's see, I've got many examples I'm trying to think of. Okay, so should I name the school? Okay.
I said sure, why not? But I was muted.
Okay, so St. Paul School for Girls in Baltimore. We began working together. This is my 4th year, so 3 years ago, and they were very clear. The head of school was very clear when she contacted me that their faculty, staff, and students and parents needed to have a skill set around challenging conversations, and then specifically around conversations of social identifiers. So race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, and more. And what she did was she gave those of us, she did 3 things that were game changers, 4 things. One was the middle school had a student committee, the upper school had a student committee, and we were given time during the school day once a month for 2 hours. One of the hours was lunch. We brought lunch for them to really do this work. So it wasn't an extra, it wasn't an add-on, it was part of their school day, which was modeling the importance of that conversation. We were given license to have really open, honest conversations within that space, and that I would always check with the group on what I was bringing out of that space. There was a faculty committee at the same time, and we ended up connecting the 3 committees to put on a day-long professional development workshop. So one was giving time, another was giving openness to the conversation, but the expectation was static. That was not going to change. The expectation was we need to grow these skills. And I worked with trustees, and the whole goal was, if we do this for a year together where I was really just listening, gathering, and connecting, then the next year we're putting most of the work back on students, faculty, administration, and trustees so that they don't need someone like me. I'm always trying to get myself worked out of a job. And then the next year was just to maintain peripheral support. So those were really helpful things. But also what Penny did, the head of school, was she consistently connected the values of the school to the work that was being done. Whether the conversation was about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice or not, when she would talk about anything about the school, she would say, and please remember, these are the values of St. Paul School for Girls, and here's how I'm connecting them to what we're doing right now. Another thing that was really, really helpful that we did was, instead of having like the public purpose night or the diversity night or that speaker come and just do that, we moved to having somebody come and speak on all those things, but also the expectation that they be spoken about everywhere. So for example, when schools ask us to come for one of those nights, I'm speaking as a parent now, but they also have the math night, the college night, and all these other things, I'm going to choose which works best in my schedule so I can opt out of those conversations. But if a school really cares about this work that you all are doing through NNSP, then when I go to the college night, I should expect to hear that when we're helping our kids look at colleges, or if we end in 8th grade and we're looking at high schools, I should expect to hear that the value of the school around this work connects to the schools that you're helping us to find. and it connects to all the speakers that we have coming in for different things. So it's shifting it. It's really simplistic and crude, but the way I think about it is we wouldn't teach geometry in an assembly, so we shouldn't do this in an assembly. We should connect it to everything, and the assemblies help support it. So those were some things that SPSG did that were really, really helpful and really made a big change in a lot of what was happening, and made it so that these conversations, and I was glad yesterday at your conference, like that there were some of the SPSG girls there, because it was always asking the question of, if not now, when, and if not us, who, but then also, if we don't know how are we going to figure out how? So expanding that conversation in a way that could be really tangible.
I realize I'm taking up all the question time. I mean, not all the question time. Does anybody else have other questions? Eric, Ivy, Hannah. Jen is an amazing resource. I believe it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jen. It's great. I've seen your name all over, and it's great to meet in real time. So thanks.
Thanks.
Expertise and wisdom.
You are two friends. Quaker educators uniting. He's at San Francisco Friends School.
Oh, San Francisco Friends was started by one of our alums. I was at Sandy Spring Friends for 15 years, and I was at Sidwell Friends before that.
Wonderful. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we're both chugging the Kool-Aid. So
yeah.
Good stuff. My question is connected to the work that NNSP is doing, and just this kind of notion of kind of public-private partnerships, and how to approach these conversations, because you talked about kind of your internal community with your faculty, and staff, kind of concentric circling out with the greater community, or maybe with neighborhood, neighbors, even maybe prospective parents. Kind of putting my cynic hat on, it's easy when you go into these partnership conversations with all the resources that independent schools have. And when you go to approach that public school, when you go to approach that kind of struggling nonprofit, or any nonprofit for that matter, the imbalance there is really apparent. And I think many of us, I don't want to speak for everybody, but I know myself, we've been in those difficult conversations where, there's cynicism, there's skepticism, there's burned bridges, there's histories of oppression and systemic injustice, all of that stuff that even with the best of intentions, you are countering this just, systemic divide that is so much larger than just us as a school, but everything is embodied in that moment, in those conversations. The inequity in the education system, the limited access, you can go all the way down to capitalism, and our faux democracy, So I guess I'm asking this kind of big question. I guess that's what Quaker schools do, is ask people. And not expecting a big answer by any means, but I was literally just having a conversation with a faculty member about this morning. That's why I'm sharing this. What to do when you have those kind of conversations with either the greater community, or maybe it's even internally. Like, we host a Horizons program here, and we've talked about this just feels so noblesse oblige. This feels like us kind of helping the others. How do you frame that? How do you talk about the inherent kind of gaps and inaccessibility, the opportunity gap, the funding gap, all of that kind of stuff? I just feel like that's something that we wrestle with, and is really about a lot of this work that we're trying to do in public partnership work. We come into it with the best of intentions, but oftentimes it's thwarted, it's met with cynicism, skepticism, that kind of thing. So I'll mute myself now, but appreciate any insight and perspective.
Sure. I think it starts with, you got to say all that. You have to say, I mean, so that I'll think about it like moving the circles out. So first of all, what is your messaging in your external messaging? Earl Harrison, who was my first head of school at Sidwell, he used to say, the moment somebody considers applying their children or themselves to your school, you've begun a relationship with them. And so like thinking about that, does your hiring information reflect that you are really seeking? Does it say, we won't discriminate against you? Or does it say we want faculty and staff who represent the global nature of education and to be there, to be in a space with us at school? Same with admissions. So it's a small thing, but I think bigger than that, I'll use an example that I did. And because we struggle with a lot of this. When I first became a principal, I'm in a town, at the center of 3 towns, not me at the center, but our school is at the center of 3 towns, kind of the Venn in the diagram. And there are 8 middle schools in our immediate area. And so I asked the 8 middle school principals to come, and we created a group called Principals in Partnership. Blake's heard me talk about this. But we had one middle school that had 8 kids, and we had one that had 1,000. And so we just had to put the questions out there and listen, and listen more. So we had to put out there, my query to the other principals was, okay, so technically we're in competition with each other, but we're also educating the kids in this town, so, in your case, a neighborhood. And so what is it that we can do to support each other in that work with our kids? Like, what could we learn from each other? What could we do together? How could we grow together? How could we do fun things together? So we did observations and professional development and invited them to our workshops. We went to their workshops. We did social events, all kinds of things. But it was really about making sure that every school had equal voice. So the school with 8 kids and the school with 1,000 kids had the same voice as the public school and the private schools. But also naming that there's historically this relationship between independent or private and public schools that is often doing for and not being with. And putting that out there, that you're trying to undo that. And so when you all slip into that needs to be a conversation that you can check each other on. And what kinds of things feel like doing with and partnering with versus doing for, and even sharing what kinds of things have happened that feel like doing for. And talking about not wanting to be part of systemic oppression and marginalization, and that's really important to you, but you're also growing in it because you're educators and we're always growing in this. So I think it's one of those things that people, my motto for my work is inviting the elephants in the room to tea. If we don't put those things out there, they inform everything we're talking about and the way people are listening to us, that can really corrode the amazing work that we're trying to do. And then our intentions are all we have. We don't have our impact. Plus, the other thing that happens in that case is if it doesn't go the way you want it to go, because those things have not been addressed, it sours the conversation going forward. So the next time somebody brings it up, it's like, oh, we tried that, it didn't work. And then I think there's also a really important piece here in terms of, is it people doing this or is it a person? If it's a person leading these conversations, that's not sustainable or systemic. That's a person's interest. And if it's truly the representation of the values of the school, then you can have the conversation within the faculty, staff, parents, students, trustees, every constituent group of what can this look like, what should it look like, and how do we connect those in between. Mm-hmm. That's really important. And finally, I would add, when I've seen it doesn't go well, is when the independent school or private school is not really in it not able to be in the space of what the other school or community space needs, but more about, and this is all unintentional, of course, but still it becomes impact, more about what works for them and what they're doing. And that also can really quickly become the kind of thing, as somebody said to me recently, they're like, oh yeah, so the next year when you try to get the calendar together, there's a lot of, oh, that's not going to work for us, as opposed to, hey, let's figure out how our calendars can work together so we can figure out time to do this. But the cynicism you shared is real, and it's important, and it's based on experience, and we can't talk anyone out of it, but I think we just have to name it name the factors that have led to it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I struggle with being a part of the system and then also benefiting from that system. So it's just inherent nature. I mean, short of hitting do-over in our complete capitalist system, what are we to do? So
right.
At the end of the day, you can only control your own actions and be part of change, hopefully. So I'm not in a position to do away with all private schools, but what can I do from my private school,
Yeah, and I think you have the privilege of having a framework of the approach for your school that necessitates this conversation. Community is one of the spices, and so being able to have that conversation with the groups that you're trying to work with or want to partner with about, communities are groups of individuals who are having a mutual impact on each other. And so what does community look like for you and your school? I really want to understand what community is like in your school. Where does it work? Where does it struggle? And then how could we create a third community that is our group, that are our groups working together? What norms do we need to create for that community space? Because I think so much of it over and over again, no matter what the topic is, when people feel really heard and really listened to and really seen, great things can happen. But when we push through and we don't do that background work, we tend to have to do it over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure.
It makes me think of Stacy Kurtzman at Castilleja once said, and I'm completely going to misquote what she said, but basically that there's multiple forms of capital. And so to acknowledge that you come with some resources, financial resources and capital, but there might be social capital and there might be intellectual capital, and to talking about power balance, and the way she sort of enlightened me in that to not shy away from having that conversation, even as like a facilitator of these conversations with educators. I feel like over the past 5 years, I've been more comfortable doing exactly what Jen said, is acknowledging that these imbalances exist is the first step of moving forward from them. Because if you pretend they're not there, then you're just perpetuating the problem. So I feel personally over the last 5 years, I've really been more comfortable about saying, well, this isn't going away. Just like what you said, Jen, this is not going away. But we can still develop an honest, earnest, faith-based, trust-filled relationship, even though that there's, these systems in place.
Yeah. And I think it also comes down to saying that, but then also asking, like, a lot of this work has to be very concrete. Like, what concretely is going to work for you and what's not going to work for you? As example, I was sharing with Blake, working with a public school and a private school to define an upcoming middle school diversity leadership conference. And the independent school teacher, the coordinator, kept saying to me, well, if your kids could come over at lunch. Well, public school kids can't do that. They can't, to request transportation, to get permission forms, to help pay for the transportation, at least this public school, that's not an option. And the independent school teacher, because of the space that she lives in, hadn't thought about that. So asking the question of what's working and what's not going to work. And then finally, one of the administrators said, our kids can never go there during the day. They can go after school if several parents drive them as like an activity that's not school sponsored. But they can come here anytime. We can adjust our schedule to accommodate them. So it requires these big picture philosophical value questions, but also then the really pragmatic, concrete of what's going to get in the way and what's not going to get in the way. And I have found a lot of times public schools have a hard time answering that question if they're not asked, because it feels like they're kind of, one administrator said to me, I feel like I'm kind of undermining my school when I say that. But when asked, then it works. So we designed for this work that we're doing together here's our idea, here's our goal, and then a list of every concrete thing from the smallest thing to what time do we need to leave to be somewhere to the biggest thing, or how many markers do we need. And then we look at each school, what can you do, what can we do, and what's left that needs to be done. And is it really important, or if it is important, who's going to take care of it? How are we going to figure that out? That has changed a lot of those conversations, that kind of really pragmatic, concrete level that we often forget because we're really focused on the bigger picture. So it needs to be as I say all the time, a both and not an either or.
Why does it always come down to the buses?
I know. I know. It's crazy.
I always say whenever I talk about having I wonders or I wish thoughts, I'm like, you need to forget your schedule, you need to forget transportation, and it's like those are they're the hurdles that are hurdles heard around the world, I think.
Yeah, but I think things like Zoom can really help with that, because you can do a lot of the pre-work together ahead of time or in between that doesn't require all that. But of course, the in-person time helps a lot. But you move from having to have 7 meetings to plan, in our case, a diversity conference, to we need to have 7 gatherings. 3 need to be in person, and 4 can be on Zoom or Google Hangout.
Mm.
That's great.
Maybe just
Eric, go.
Maybe just building on that idea of the buses challenges and schedule challenges and that sort of thing. Jen, I'm curious to hear from you. How do you see these conversations playing out among public and private schools? Quite literally, who are the people who are at the table? And I ask that because often I'm reminding myself that I'm very, very fortunate to be able to focus on partnerships work and engaging communities near and far. There's not necessarily an equivalent person or position at public schools, for example, at least in the local area. So it is often someone who is wearing multiple hats.
Yeah.
Where this is a nice to do, but it's not necessarily, in some cases, even part of their job description. What are you seeing? Has it changed at all? And absent a facilitator like you, how are you seeing things play out?
Yeah, I think, I always go to what I've seen work and what I haven't seen doesn't work. What doesn't work is when the independent school, and this is the onus that falls on us, when the independent school is kind of calling the public school or emailing or something like that. What does work better is to say, I want to just introduce who we are. Yep. And think about that we're sharing space. And can I bring lunch one day or bring coffee one day and go to their space or ask if they'd rather meet in between and have that conversation. And then maybe just like, what does it look like to share space? How could we support each other? Mm-hmm. And then if we're going to move it beyond us, who should we engage in your school and in our school, and how can we do that? So it's firstly going to, I have not ever seen it work where a public school administrator goes to an independent school and says, hey, let's figure out how to partner, without some entree or invitation, because there is a lot of stuff around that. But going to them and having that conversation, I do think it's really helpful in that to be, kind of esoteric and, these are our values and this is what we want to have, but also really concrete. We're having this speaker come in and he's going to be speaking about, learning differences. And we'd like to open some spaces up to your school, or we're engaged in our professional development right now. One of the things we want to do is have teachers observe other teachers. Do you have any teachers who we could have observe your teachers, or would your teachers like to observe ours? So some concrete things too, but then also what else would work? Asking that conversation of what else would work is really helpful. And thinking about the physical space. I work at a Montessori school that I was there. We were doing just EDIJ stuff. And I kept noticing that there's a fence along the back of their property. And on the other side of the fence is a huge public school. And the kids weren't even looking at each other. And I said, what's your relationship to them? And they were like, huh, we used to have a relationship with them. So I went over to the public school and said, hey, I'm working with this other school and I noticed you guys are separated by a fence. And I'm just curious, they're doing a fall festival next week. Do you think any of your kids would want to come? And I brought us over some flyers. And, but I was just a consultant. I'm not working for the school, so I couldn't do more than that. But it required asking that question and then going to the other space and just inviting and continuing to invite, but also seeing if you guys can share things. So it needs to be asking, administrator to administrator, if we were to engage further, who could we bring into this conversation? How many people? Think about everybody who could be involved. And really the kids. If you get kids talking or, asking, is there a class that I could talk with some of the kids or a group of the leadership that I could talk to them about what this could look like from their perspective, what they wonder about, what stereotypes have they heard, that kind of thing, and how could we break that down? Then you've got, kid narrative and data collection is the strongest, I think, always. So something along those lines. And here's a concrete thing that I did for years, and it was really fabulous. And this is best for middle school, because upper school has other things going on, and lower school it's kind of late. But we were at a Quaker school, so we called it Real Friends, REEL, Friends, capital F, film. And we showed movies, regular movies, once a month. Different clubs could sell snacks and to support their clubs or their organization. And then we had student facilitators who would facilitate the conversation. So even if it was The Incredibles, which we did one time, we were really focused on EDIJ all the time. We had the kids pull the equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice themes out of the movie and then had a 20-minute facilitated conversation by kids. And in doing Real Friends films, we invited some of the other schools as much as we could have capacity for, and put in the schedule. If it was our school having a group do the fundraising that night, then the next time it was the other school, or anyone who wanted to. Really concrete, very pragmatic, lots and lots of energy around it. Asha probably would work well with 9th graders or 10th before they start driving. And brought adults into the space too. And it doesn't have to be chaperoned by the teachers from that school. And so you don't have to deal with the transportation stuff.
Great. Thank you.
Sure.
I'll just offer on a different note as well. You've mentioned a few times, and I appreciate the idea of going back to the core values and the school's values and making that front and center. In a past life, I worked at an organization where the head of that organization was constantly talking about the mission and the vision and the values of that organization. Yep. So much so that there was often eye rolling
Yes.
in the audience. And I think it was only when I left that I really came to appreciate, and that person happened to be the founder as well. So there was, something deeply seated there. But I came to appreciate later that idea of this is what we're all about. I want to remind you of it. I want to remind all of us. I know you've heard it before, but this is who we are. And I think in terms of framing how that plays out practically, I came to value that deeply myself as well. So I thank you for sharing that as well.
Sure. And I think so often we can all, if any of us have been in multiple schools, we've probably all had the experience where there are things that are happening that people feel really strongly have to happen, but they're really about that person and
Sure.
not necessarily connected
Sure.
to the values of the school.
Sure.
Or maybe they were once and they're not anymore. So how much time and energy are we putting into this?
Yeah.
Another way to kind of frame this in terms of getting people on board that Blake was talking about, and as you were talking about with connecting to the values, is, and this is just Jen Cort language, so bear with me. We have the culture carriers in a school and we have the culture creators in a school. And the culture carriers are the ones who are kind of, we've always done it this way. It's tradition. They're often the more seasoned teachers. And the culture carriers are the ones who are, innovating all the time and really asking why. And so often we in faculty groups and in life groups feel like we need to convince the other side to win. We need to win. If only they'd think like us, we'd be fine. But the reality is a school can't have systemic and sustainable programming and growth if they're ignoring one of those. We will not do well if we're only constantly in innovation, and we won't do well if we're only constantly in we've always done it this way. So we need to, I feel one way to get people on board is to name that we all need to be culture creators and carriers, and that schools need both. And so that role is important. And then so that we can listen to both to now help create what our culture is now. So instead of focusing on the winning, it's, so you don't want to be involved in this conversation. Okay, I hear that. But this is part of where so let's also hear from those who feel like we have to be in this conversation, and not from a winning place, but from a community minded place to create our norms in an intentional way. And the norms are reflecting our values.
That's great. Thank you.
Sure.
I'm sorry to have to do this. I need to jump off.
Okay.
But thank you so much, Jen, and to the rest of you as well. It's great to see you.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Likewise. Thank you.
And we are running close to the end of our hour. So does anybody have any last questions for Jen as we close up?
I too have to run. I'm sorry. I'm coming on another meeting. But Jen, it was a real pleasure to connect. Thanks for sharing your perspective and experience. And hopefully we can connect again soon.
My pleasure. And I've been making a list of the things that I've said. Oh, Blake, I'll send that to you. So I'll send them to Blake so that she can share them with you in case they're of interest.
Perfect.
Okay, sounds good. All right, take care, everyone.
Thanks, you too.
Hannah, you were about to say something.
Well, yeah, but then I realized that this might be a little longer of a conversation. But one of the things that we've been kind of dealing with here, so I don't know if you've heard of the Laquan McDonald case in the Jason Van Dyke trial that was happening in Chicago, but a white police officer shot Laquan McDonald 16 times and was convicted and found guilty of second-degree murder. So this all happened on Friday. He was convicted and the sentencing is still pending. But this was like a really big thing that happened, of course, on top of the Kavanaugh nomination. And so on Monday, when we came back to school, we kind of hit pause and had everybody skip first period and come into a community meeting that was divided by grades. And I'm still kind of wrestling with like what the best like structure is for something like that. I think for some students it felt like we've never done this before, so why now? Which my response to that is, well, there's a time to start something, and if this is like a practice that we want to have as a school, then that might be that's a good thing. But I'm wondering, I guess, in either of your experiences, if you've had conversations with schools or found ways that I think a lot of schools have maybe this time built into their schedule. Ours doesn't. So I don't know if there are any schools that don't have this time built in, how you kind of deal with current issues and who leads those conversations if your faculty isn't yet at the level to be able, or at the comfort level to be able to lead them themselves. So
yeah. It's such a hard thing. And I think if you don't have that time carved out, and there are quite a few schools that don't, but if you don't have that time carved out, then teachers must use class time. But that doesn't mean that every teacher has to talk about it. So you could, I did this with advisories, but you could do it with first period teachers and second period teachers and third period teachers, or if you have a rotating schedule, people in the same band. That you have buddies. So when there's a big subject that you need to discuss, those two groups can come together, and if you're buddying up, you want to make sure that you have somebody who's really naturally, we always have the teachers who are naturally comfortable talking about these things. And then we have some who really aren't, and some who shouldn't, who are in the middle. So partner strength with challenge. And so then they can come together and think about how are we going to help the kids have this conversation. They can even combine as groups, because that allows the big group to break into smaller groups, and they can co-lead the conversation if they want to, which is a really nice way to help grow those skills. But that needs to be the support, and it'd be neat if do you have like a student leadership program?
Yes, we do.
so you could ask the kids, say that, we realize we haven't had this framework for having these conversations, but there's so many things we need to talk about. What do you think would be helpful and what's really not helpful in that conversation? The thing is that if it's not intentionally created, they will, even if they're quiet, they're not fully engaged. And I've got stuff on information on time and energy that I can share with you that shows that kids, when that's background app, when all their apps are open, it's hard to pay attention. Their phone runs more slowly. So when their brain's thinking about all these other big things, it's hard to focus on it. And one of the keys in that is that we need to make sure there's space for kids. So that I was blanking on the name, but of course, all that history. We need to make sure that we acknowledge that for some kids, this doesn't have immediate relevance. So they're not undermining the work. And for some kids, it has so much relevance it may be painful to talk about so that they're being heard. And then other kids in the middle. So, and that's going to shift depending on the topic. The kids who may have been charged about the Kavanaugh hearings may not have been charged about this trial or vice versa. And so how do we support each other and ourselves when we are in each of those spaces, when it's not relevant for us right now, when it's so relevant that it's overwhelming us, and when we're in the middle. So you can break it down in that way, which that conversation in of itself creates a new set of norms. And then if you have the teachers working together so that you have it if you have buddies in every block period, that's great. They have like a little peer group. And then it's easier for you on the scheduling end.
Right. Yeah. And then we do have an advisory program, so that could naturally be a good fit. I think what's the challenge with that is feeling like all advisors are prepared to hold those conversations. And so a buddy system allows for that to match kind of strengths. Yeah.
And on my website, I have a whole section on advisory, and there's a bunch of free lessons that you can have that get at some of these things that you can even you could even do them as a test or not use them at all. But if you liked some of them, you could say, hey, what is this? What does it seem like to you? Let's try it this way. If this doesn't work for us, what would we do instead? Because that invites a conversation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
That's project-based learning for the teachers. I love the buddy idea, right? It's like you can learn so much just by co-hosting the conversation with somebody else. Another thing is, Jen, you have this plethora of advisory activities available, and I think sometimes choice is good for everybody, and so saying here is a number of activities we could do surrounding whatever topic you want to talk about. Which one are you comfortable leading with your advisory? I think that's fantastic. Everybody likes a little choice and a little control over what they're being tasked to talk about.
Yeah. I mean, the advisory lessons, when I'm working with a school rewriting or strengthening their advisory program, first we have to acknowledge that nobody's trained to be an advisor. Most independent school teachers don't have degrees in education. If they did, they probably weren't trained to be an advisor. It's something like, oh, you're going to teach Spanish, and by the way, you're going to be an advisor. And now, by the way, you're going to deal with possible sexual assault and police Black violence. These are big things to ask people to do. And as a principal, I sometimes got frustrated because I've been doing advisory work for almost 30 years before they were calling it advisory work. And I was like, come on, we can do this. And we're a Quaker school. We should definitely be able to do this. But I realized that I was really asking more than the teachers had the capacity to do. And so they were unintentionally undermining it some, like, oh, we'll just get through this and then we can go do our own thing. But when we partnered, it did strengthen the capacity for both. It also, on a pragmatic level, was really nice. Like, if I can't be there to take attendance, but I have a buddy, my kids know to go to that advisory to take attendance. That kind of thing. And it just creates a framework. If you have advisory, it's a great space for these conversations, but it does need some support. And advisors do need some help in strengthening their relationship to advisory.
Yeah.
Do you have anyone going to the AMLE conference? Do you know?
I don't know. What is it?
It's the Association of Middle Level Educators.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you do.
If you do, I mean, if you happen to, they have a whole track that is on, I can't remember the exact words, but it's like creating culture. And it's I'm speaking on it twice, but it's the track is specifically to support classroom culture and advisory culture and advisory work and relationships. So if not, AMLE has loads of resources on all of this that they, it's pretty inexpensive to join them. And NNSP, you all do a lot on advisory too, I believe, right?
We do. Oh, am I mute? No, I'm not muted. We do, but not quite as extensive as you do. But we do some work on advisory, but not quite. I would say it's sort of in larger brushstrokes than specific lesson plans and strategies. I really wish we had it developed more, honestly.
Yeah, the cool thing, if you go with that as deepening that connection, is those are the skills that every teacher needs in their classrooms anyway. So whether you're an advisor, formally named an advisor or not, advising skills are part of what we need in our for all of these conversations. And there's a lot of resources. And like I said, there's stuff on my website, but I'm also happy to share anything. I'm always happy to just share.
Okay, thank you.
If you're looking for stuff along those lines, if I have it, I'll give it to you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
I think, Jen, it's so much what we were saying yesterday about how it has to come from the top down. And I think the hiring process is often overlooked as a place for systemic change. And so that with every new teacher, if it's really concretely explained in some way in new faculty orientation or in your job interview or whatever, that these are the expectations of what you're going to do. And here is some professional development, how you can do it. Especially when you get young, new teachers, you can really shift a school because then they'll grow into being the leaders of the work in addition to being their content masters.
Yeah, and my last piece on that was when I was working at Sidwell. So this is, I don't know, I left, I think, almost 20 years ago, something like that. We were the first school to really be talking about advisory in that way in the city. And we began with a 4-year process so that by the end of 4 years in our hiring practices, it was equally important to the kind of relationship you have with your students along the framework of what we think of as advisory, but it's really about advising kids, as it was to be in your core content. And so we had to build toward that. But it definitely can be done. And a lot of the times those people never became formal advisors, but were able to help us have some pretty challenging conversations with our students.
I mean, Hannah, I would assume every teacher for the most part is an advisor, right? Are there teachers?
Yeah. Science, we don't have science teachers because of minutes for teaching in a lab. But besides that, it's every other faculty member for the most part. Yeah.
So you don't, it's sort of all encompassing.
Yeah.
And the culture, I love Jen. I love that you said it was 4 years because it's just, it just doesn't happen overnight.
Oh yeah. If we're doing the flash in a pan, that's not sustainable or systemic.
Right.
You can't build on that. Then you're frustrated and you don't want to go back and do the work that you need to do to go forward.
Right.
I agreed 100%. I recognize that we've gone completely over the time.
That's okay.
I apologize. This is great. I could talk to both of you all day long.
Thank you so much for putting this together, Blake. And thanks, Jen, for coming and speaking. This was really helpful.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you, Blake, for having me.
Sure. And when Jen sends me the information, I'll send it out to everybody. And in that is Jen's contact. And if you can't find it, just let me know.
Okay.
I for sure put you in contact with her. And then I'll see you all soon.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank
you.
Thank you all. Talk to you guys soon.
Bye.
Bye.